Not just this past weekend, but the weekend before, there was this deep, deep freeze that hit the Canadian prairies, and that's where Brian and I normally are. We're next door to Alberta in Saskatchewan, but that grid had problems. It sent out multiple alerts, which freaked people out because, you know, it's one thing to say, okay, conserve electricity or the grid's going to go down, but it was minus 50, you know, and minus 40, minus 30s, depending on where you were. Like there was, I think it was minus 46 in one place. So the average temperature across most of the province was minus 31 when this started on January 11th, what I believe was a Friday. And so the Alberta Energy System Operator registered a new hourly electricity demand record, which was only up slightly from December 22's record. However, they would have had problems because Friday use of electricity is down a little bit from the rest of the week, and it's way down on the weekend because of industrial operations. I guess people slack off on Fridays, or, you know, maybe just don't do as much. But 1.1 gigawatts was coming in from wind that day on Friday. Otherwise, some people say the grid would have gone down. So people are blaming wind for not blowing when the alerts actually came out on the weekend, because the wind wasn't blowing and the sun wasn't shining. So, but the fact is, it saved the grid. The grid probably would have gone down on Friday. So that triggered a series of 4 alerts over as many days. And yeah, people are not happy about it, and they want to blame something. So they're blaming renewables, which is odd because we all, you know, if you listen to the show on a regular basis, we give you examples of stories of time after time where renewables and battery storage have saved grids, have made them more stable. In the future, that's the kind of future we're going to live in, is a more stable grid. I'm sick of power outages here. The wind was only putting out 20 megawatts instead of 1.1 gigawatts, which is a tiny, tiny fraction. If it wasn't a surprise, because their wind forecast was actually dead on, Brian. They knew this was coming. So they, it's not like wind was unpredictable. They actually have forecasting algorithms that check everything out and tell you what's going to happen, how much electricity is going to be produced and when, what time of day. And all that worked out fine. So in the event that it had happened during the week, it would have been a problem, they say. Experts have been piping up about this after the fact. So wind actually saved the grid's butt. Each time, shortly after they were issued, demand plummeted and the alerts were lifted. And yeah, of the 14 energy-conserving tips provided by the regulator when they came out with these alerts, one to avoid was charging your electric car. And of course, because there are a bunch of, you know, we're not the most progressive people here on the prairies of Canada. There's not a lot of electric cars. There may be 10,000 of them or something like that in Alberta, but there's not. It was an insignificant thing of, you know, part of the discussion. For one thing, most cars would actually be charged at the time. We're going to talk more about disinformation later in the show, but most cars aren't always charging. They're charged, or they're charged. You know, a small fraction of them are charging at any given time, and there really wasn't that many of them. It's a population of several million people, so it's a small fraction. Plus, consumers are only like 20% of the electricity use. It's actually, you know, industrial processes in Alberta take up the majority of it, and there's other things too, like agriculture. Anyway, it's just not warranted. This, you know, there's been just a flow of misinformation and hatred towards the solutions to climate change that we discuss on the show, and we'll talk more later in the show.
Yeah, a clothes dryer uses about the same amount of electricity as plugging an electric car, and obviously there's way more electric clothes dryers.
How about telling people not to dry their clothes, huh? How about that?
Yeah.
Don't dry your clothes or to cook a turkey.
Wait, they didn't do that?
No.
They didn't tell people not to dry clothes?
No, they didn't. They said they brought in, so now everybody thinks electric cars are the problem, you know? Because people, unfortunately, are misinformed and dumb. Generally speaking, they're, you know, I find that I really have to work hard to keep up with everything that we talk about on the show. And your average Joe's not going to do that. So it's hard to explain to people. So there was 2 gas plants. It was actually gas plants that had shut down or underproduced because of the cold weather. This happened in Texas a couple of years ago, too. The gas was the major contributor to it. And apparently they don't have much battery storage there, but it's actually saved the grid for hours before they had to put out these alerts. The batteries actually, started, and if we had more of them, which we will and need to as fast as possible. Yeah. So there was only a small connection to our grid here in Saskatchewan, the size of one small gas plant or one medium-sized solar farm. Pembina Institute study says that a green grid by 2035 would save ratepayers in that province $600 per year. And of course, everyone thinks the opposite because they're told the opposite. You could say whatever you want. If it's negative, people lap it up. I should have a negative YouTube channel talking about, gas cars. Maybe I should just go negative and people, oh. Well, gas cars aren't new to people, so they're not going to freak out. Anything that's new and not quite understood. And our premier here, the boss, the political boss of our province, said that, we gave them lots of fossil fuels to save their butt, when in fact, we took in more than we gave them from the province next door, which has a bunch of hydro. It's almost all hydro. So we were actually using a non-fossil fuel source to make up for what we were giving them and then some. So it's the world we live in. Politics, people are coming out against so much. So we'll see what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I just wanted to follow up on that. So again, the cold snap that we talked about last week, and there were certain problems that there was a big news story about Chicago, where there was a huge deep freeze and there were electric cars piling up at the charging stations. And so, of course, again, lots of negative news stories. Now, there was a lot of truth to this problem. It was a genuine problem. And it comes from, a few different things, a lack of education about how these things work, for one. But Out of Spec Reviews on YouTube had a really good breakdown of what happened in Chicago and why it was a problem for electric car charging. And I thought it was really interesting. For one thing, in Chicago, a lot of new Uber drivers on the Uber network driving electric cars. So Uber has a deal with Tesla where the drivers can rent Teslas. And but if a lot of them come on to the system at one time, and if a lot of those Uber drivers don't have home charging, which is often the case, then they can only charge at the superchargers. And so that also means that your car is going to deep freeze overnight. So if you don't have home charging, it's generally not a huge problem if you're always charging at a fast charger. But what happens in a cold snap is if it's not plugged in overnight, it gets sort of cold soaked, and then that battery takes extra time to warm up when you plug it into the fast charger just to be able to accept a charge. So it could be sitting there for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, even 30 or 45 minutes if it's really, really cold, and it'll look like it's not charging, but what it's doing is just warming the battery. So that was one of the problems. A lot of people plugged in, not getting any juice, thinking that the chargers were broken when they weren't. But even if they did think the chargers were working, well, it's a problem because, you're waiting for 30 minutes just to warm up the battery. And this leads to a backup of people at the chargers. And I was talking about my partner drove to Prince Albert, Saskatchewan in the north and didn't have problems with our Tesla Model S, partly because it's got really good range and because it preconditions the battery when you're on the road before you get to the charger. And when it's nice and warm, preconditioned, it accepts
So
a very
they probably
fast
didn't have
charge.
enough time to do this, Brian, when they're going from their apartment to the closest supercharger, unlike your partner on the highway, which you can program and it knows in advance and makes a decision to heat up the battery. We're talking very cold weather here. And she was in much colder weather than Chicago had.
Yeah. And, the solution may have been for those Uber drivers to find like maybe a level 2 station where you can just leave it for a while. Now, of course, you're not earning your income then as an Uber driver. But I just wanted to point out, because I don't think I mentioned it last week, but so she was in Prince Albert for about 3 days, minus, 35 Celsius kind of temperature. She did keep it plugged in to a 110 outlet, the whole time she was there. And that keeps the battery from having that deep freeze, so that when she did go to the supercharger before she left town, she was already accepting a decent charge.
Energy Show.